This is NDTV, and you're watching Classics.
Hello and welcome to Talking Heads. Today we have with us the American ambassador to India, Sir Robert Blackwill. He's been a professor at Harvard and he's been in India for about 8 weeks now. But since September the 11th, it's been a terrible time for him. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I'd say almost every night since September the 11th, I've had a dream or a nightmare with something to do with the terrorist attacks. And I'm sure everybody around the world has done the same. How has the world changed after September the 11th?
I think strategists are struggling with that, and any answer now has to be provisional because we're all digesting it. But I would say it's changed in three ways, and let me stress again my professorial caution here that this is provisional. First is, I think every power, and especially the great powers, including India, are trying to assess how the tragic events of September 11th affect their external orientation.
Yes.
And so you see this in the case of Russia with President Putin in Germany yesterday. You see that Chancellor Schroeder, I think both of them gave statements yesterday that they wouldn't have given a month ago, including about Chechnya. You see it's true of the United States, you see it's true of China, and you see an impulse toward a calmer U.S.-China relationship. So I think the first thing is the big powers are trying to assess.
Did you say a calmer U.S.-China?
Yeah. Yes, I think since then, as you know, very early on in the and I apologize for my Kansas accent, very early on in the post-September 11th period, President Bush and President Jiang Zemin spoke with one another on the phone. There have been very frequent contacts since then, including on the intelligence side, which I think are quite unprecedented in the U.S.-China relationship. So there's that one. I could go on, so the first thing I'd say is the major powers are reassessing their basic orientations and seeing how these events affect those orientations. Second is, I would say that there is a preoccupation with the problem of terrorism, which is, again, unknown before. Of course, terrorism has been with us since the caves, if I may put it like that, and before. But in more recent years, there's been no global preoccupation with terrorism.
Before you come to your third point, on this point I'd like to ask you, the America's declared sort of a global war on terrorism, the first war of the 21st century. In that context, what is a terrorist? Well, in this preoccupation with terrorism, how do you define a terrorist?
I think this is probably for international lawyers to do more than myself, but let me tell you what a terrorist is. A terrorist is someone who murders innocent people for political purposes or for ideological purposes or for religious purposes. I think that this definition, it can probably be improved upon. They can scrub it, my colleagues at the Harvard Law School or the Yale Law School. But I think that will do to describe a very great proportion of international terrorism and domestic terrorism too, for that matter.
So do you say that the old phrase of one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, terrorism with a cause, has that gone?
It's dead. My colleague and friend Condoleezza Rice said over last weekend on one of the Sunday talk shows in the United States, they're not good terrorists and bad terrorists, they're just terrorists. And I think that that's the second big change.
Please, carrying on that point.
Carry on.
I did ask this question to someone else earlier about, say, the people in Kashmir who blow up buses or hijack planes or kill people at bus stops. But they say they've got a cause. Would you define them as terrorists?
I would like to say this, which is a more generic proposition. I would think the days are over when any movement anywhere can justify its actions which kill innocent people on the basis of political objective or ideology or religion. I believe those days are gone. I think you will never see a leader again at the United Nations make such an assertion. And
so you'll never get a leader again say, this is not a terrorist, this is a freedom fighter.
Well, if you might get one, but I think there would be virtually no sympathy for the proposition that there's any excuse whatsoever in any human circumstance to kill innocent people for those other purposes. I just don't, I believe that that was an important thing that happened post-September 11th. And you can see this
point as well.
You can see this manifestation, let me just say, you can see this manifestation in dozens and dozens and dozens of countries.
Yes.
The third thing, which is a more abstract proposition, but in a way maybe related to two above, maybe the most long-lasting, as maybe again a former professor, I think we may see emerging a new international code of conduct. And this international code of conduct, if it does emerge, seems to be very widespread, if not global in character, and seems to say what we were talking about a minute ago, that the international community as such will no longer permit terrorism.
So in a way, September 11th is a major turning point in the history of the world's view of terrorism. Coming to the second point about the global war on terrorism and nations that harbor terrorists. Would you define Afghanistan as a nation that harbors terrorism?
Oh, of course, of course. But let me say again, I think, of course, without any question, the Taliban harbor terrorists. But again, I think it's more pertinent, it's understandable that Indians and people from this part of the world will be preoccupied with Afghanistan. But it isn't the only place where this occurs. There are other countries, some quite far from here, that do this. And I want to say something here about why this war, this campaign, has to be global. There are two reasons it has to be global. The first is a moral reason. You can't maintain the integrity of your moral argument if you say that terrorism is terrible over here, but for some reason it's okay over here.
Yes.
So the first reason is moral, that it has to be global. But the second is very practical. Unless it's global, there will be places that provide sanctuary for these terrorists, and that's where they'll run. And so you'll give them a refuge, and you must give them no refuge. You must get them on the run.
There's no sort of territorial aspect to terrorism.
That's exactly right. And so you must get them on the run and try to be sure there's no place they can go which will harbor them. Because if there is such a place, that's where they'll go and they'll feel safe. And what will they do there? They'll plan for further horrendous terrorist actions against our countries, like September 11th.
That place today, it's America tomorrow. So it's not. There's no territorial imperative with that.
No territorial barrier.